Lot number 15 is a story entitled On Backgammon Time. And I thought of it when my mind was totally empty the other day. And I'm so incredibly grateful to our great friend who donated the most exquisite backgammon set I think I've ever seen, which goes with the story.
On Backgammon Time. I imagine that the title of this tale means nothing to you. After all, how could you have heard of such a curious thing? There was a time when I was, as you are now, unknowing and raw. A time when I had not ventured to the land of Grosticam. On another evening, I will regale you with tales of my wider adventure and explain how the curse that now afflicts me was meted out there. But for now, I would like to offer an episode that was quite unlike anything that had occurred in my life until that time. It centred around my love for backgammon. You see, I come from a family of traders, the kind who spend their lives in the old cities of the East. They while away the hours waiting for buyers to peruse their wares. But such is life, and customers are few and far between. And that means one thing, a life of sweet mint tea, stories, and endless games of backgammon. When youth had drained away into adulthood, my father pointed at me, then at the horizon. "You are to go on a journey," he said. "Why, Baba?" I answered. "Because you are far too clean and comfortable, and because if you are to succeed in life, you will need hands far less smooth than you now have." "Where should I go?" I asked. My father balked at the question. "Anywhere, but only come back when what you take for certainty has been changed by experience." At dawn the next morning I set off, and after a litany of adventures reached the ancient crumbling walls of that desert outpost, the land of Grosticam. At first glance there was nothing especially unusual about it. The buildings were made from stone hewn from the nearby mountains, which circled the plain. The bazaar was packed with the kind of wares found in such places, drawn from all corners of the compass. There were heaps of ripe pomegranates and melons as fine as any I'd ever seen, baskets woven by prisoners in the next kingdom, and all manner of magical supplies, including blocks of sulphur and antimony. Above the great bazaar, perched atop the city wall, was a tea-house. By day and by night, a riotous miscellany of characters dwelt there, as though washed up by a freak wave of adventure. Most of them appeared to be fugitives, thieves or liars. I was very careful not to have anything to do with any of them. But something stirred in me. It seemed as if I might at last be nearing the answer to the riddle my father had set me. The day after my arrival, I noticed a very elderly man seated alone in the corner of the tea-house. He had wizened features, but a distinguished countenance. It appeared that he had been born of good blood, but had fallen on hard times. His only possession was a magnificent backgammon set. To my surprise, no one ever challenged him to a game, it being such an exquisite board, inlaid with mother of pearl, that I went over and introduced myself. The next thing I knew, I was seated across from the man, a shaker in my hand. Before rolling to ascertain who was to take black and who was to take white, I decided whether we were playing for money. For even in the bazaars of my own land, the merchants wagered a small amount so as to take it and make it a little bit more exciting. The wizened owner of the backgammon set ran the side of his hand down his long nose like a bird preening a wing. "In Grosticam, we do not play for coinage," he answered. "Rather, we play for a different kind of currency." I frowned, then managed half a smile. "I don't understand," I said. The ancient sniffed hard, his nostrils distending. "We play for time," he said. I did not understand, but imbued with youthful enthusiasm, I shrugged. "Sounds as fine a currency as any to me," I riposted, and with that I shook the dice, and so did he. A youth spent in the bazaars of my own country had, I mused, afforded me a clear advantage, for right from the start I dominated. The game was going so well for me that at one stage I even apologised. My wizened opponent said nothing. He simply smiled wryly to himself. A little time after the first game had begun, my run of luck with the dice turned. It was as though they were against me. However devious my play, I didn't get the numbers I needed, and to my despair, the first game went to him. As I bemoaned my loss, slapping a hand playfully to my knee, something happened that took me by surprise, something that caused me to shake right down to the bone. You see, as I conceded defeat, I felt myself age by a decade. And at the same moment, my wizened challenger appeared 10 years younger than he had moments before. I frowned and cursed. He smiled. "What just happened?" I asked quickly. "Time," uttered my opponent. "You mean?" "Time slipped away from you and came to me." I swallowed hard. But how could such a monstrous thing take place? The man across from me smiled again. His skin was brighter, his eyes less sagged. "By the magic of the board," he said. "You mean that 10 years of my life have been stolen from me?" I cried. No, the player corrected. "They have not been stolen from you, they have been won from you." I sat there, perspiration running down my face as my mind turned in horror. What was I to do? Play on and risk losing more time while rejuvenating my adversary? Or leave now and return home older and more ripened than I would have wished? Chilled with fear, I agreed to a second game. I would stop at nothing until I defeated him, drawing on the tactics I'd seen used in the bazaars of my hometown. So we played a second game. This time, he went first and got a streak of good dice. But then, as so often happens, the numbers changed in my favour. I was drenched in sweat, but my opponent was as calm could be. I found this remarkable, as though he were unfazed by the thought of losing his recent gains. The game went on and on, each one of us playing more brilliantly than I have ever seen on a board so lovely as that one. The ancient, who of course was no longer quite so aged, had a mastery that impressed me greatly. But as we reached the end of the match, it was I who trounced him. "Ha!" I exclaimed in the most spirited voice ever to have left my lungs. As the sound drifted out through the open window and over the old city of Grosticam, I felt the lost decade return. At the same time, my adversary's appearance was as aged as it had been when I first challenged him. As soon as the second game was over, I shook his hand and expressed my sincerest thanks for the most enlivening and dangerous of afternoons. "I do not wish to appear impolite," I said, "but after all, an elderly gentleman such as yourself has already enjoyed a long life, and, I hope, a happy one." The man looked at me, his eyes glazed over with cataracts. A single tear welled in his left eye and ran down the length of his cheek, the skin of his face wrinkled like elephant hide. "Might I inquire your age?" he said. I told him, "I'm 20. The ancient sniffed again, as though greatly troubled. "I am the same age as you," he said. My gaze roamed from his face down onto the board, that damned backgammon board, the one that controlled the currency of life and death. "I am so sorry," I whispered. And with that, I left the tea house, my head hung low in gratitude and in shame. Returning to my father's mountainside, I spoke the story of Grosticam. When the last word had left my mouth, I said, "Baba, when I embarked from this hillside, I believed that a day lived was a day imprinted onto my soul. But now that I have experienced that wretched board, I can never again take time for granted. After all, whatever we believe it to be, time is quite evidently not what it would seem."